The first thing I remember is the sound. Not the roar of the flames, not the splintering wood, but the high-pitched scream of propane tanks turning into grenades. It was 2:34 a.m., and the mountain air carried the crack of explosions across the lake like gunfire. I tore out of bed before my wife's voice even reached me. The window glowed orange, and in that instant, I knew my family's history was being devoured. I sprinted barefoot across gravel that cut into my feet, the night air thick with smoke so bitter it felt like swallowing knives. Out beyond the cabins, where my grandfather's tools had slept for 8 decades, the maintenance shed was an inferno. Flames leapt higher than the pines, casting long shadows that turned the resort into a battlefield of silhouettes. Beside me, Sarah clutched her robe tight, her face streaked with tears that caught the firelight like molten glass. Behind us, our boys, 16, wide-eyed, barefoot, stood frozen, caught between childhood and the cruel realization that nothing is safe forever. That shed wasn't just a building. It was every nail my grandfather pounded by hand in 1943. It was the smell of cedar planks he milled himself, the bent-handled hammer he refused to replace because it had character, the outboard motor he'd salvaged after the war and used to take my father fishing. It was 3 generations of sweat crystallized into wood and steel. And now it was turning to ash while I stood powerless, tasting salt and smoke on my tongue. The fire trucks took 20 minutes to arrive. By then, there wasn't much left to save. A few neighbors wandered out of their glass-walled fortresses in Thornfield Estates, snapping photos with their phones as though my family's ruin were just another mountain attraction. And then her, Delilah Thornfield. She appeared at dawn, hair perfect, coffee cup steaming in her manicured hand. Where most saw catastrophe, she saw opportunity. The smile on her lips didn't match the tragedy in front of her. It was the smile of someone watching a chessboard where the opponent had just lost their queen. "Terrible loss, Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying that lawyerly calm that could slice open a vein without raising its tone. "Perhaps this is the universe nudging you toward a more modern solution." I wanted to strike her right there, but instead, I swallowed the rage until it burned hotter than the wreckage. That was the night Pine Haven Cabin Resort stopped being just a business. It became a battlefield. 6 months earlier, the war hadn't yet begun. Back then, life was simple in its demands, complicated only by the weather and the occasional broken water line. Pine Haven wasn't flashy. 12 cabins leaned against the lake like old men swapping stories. They had weathered silver by 80 summers of rain and sunlight. Guests didn't come here for infinity pools or valet service. They came because the cabins still smelled of wood smoke, because the water was cold enough to steal your breath in June, because my wife greeted them with warm cookies at check-in, and my boys taught their kids how to tie fishing knots without bleeding on the bait. We weren't rich, but we were whole. And in a world where everything felt disposable, Pine Haven was proof that some things could endure. Until Thornfield Estates moved in. They arrived in glossy brochures promising eco-friendly luxury and harmonious mountain living. What rose instead were glass and steel palaces bigger than city libraries, each one strangling the land until not a tree dared to survive. And with them came the HOA, an entity less about community standards and more about power, wielded with the precision of a scalpel and the cruelty of a whip. At first, it was letters. Stainwood demanded. New signage required. Landscaping, out of harmony with neighborhood aesthetic. Always wrapped in legal jargon. Always with deadlines that no working family could meet. But I could have handled letters. Even fines. What I couldn't stomach was the look in Delilah Thornfield's eyes every time we spoke. That glimmer that said, "This isn't about compliance. It's about control." By the time the shed went up in flames, the message was clear. They wanted Pine Haven erased. But here's the thing about families like mine. We don't fold. My grandfather survived war, poverty, and the kind of winters that turned men brittle. My father survived recessions, droughts, and the tourism crashes that wiped out every other business on this lake. And me? I wasn't about to let a handful of silk-clad parasites decide that my children's inheritance belonged in their balance sheets. That night, As the fire trucks drowned the embers in a hiss of steam, I made myself a promise. Delilah thought she could scare me into selling. She thought fire could break a man who'd been raised by generations who built with their bare hands. She was wrong. This wasn't the end of Pine Haven. It was the beginning of war. The morning after the fire, the smell still clung to me like a second skin. Smoke has a way of burrowing into your clothes, your hair, even your lungs. Sarah stood at the kitchen sink scrubbing dishes that were already clean, her shoulders rigid with the kind of anger that refuses to spill over, because if it does, it'll drown you. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked without turning around. I didn't have to ask who. She was smiling. I said, each word like gravel grinding in my throat. Sarah's hands froze on the dish. Then she did it. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to admit it out loud. Not to her. Not to the boys who sat silent at the table pretending their cereal didn't taste like ashes. But in my gut, I knew Delilah Thornfield had orchestrated this. And if she was willing to set fire to 80 years of history, then we weren't fighting over property lines anymore. We were fighting for survival. The HOA's war began quietly, almost politely. It started with a letter typed in a font so neat it looked smug. Notice of noncompliance. Our cabins, they said, were inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. Translation: too rustic for the glass palaces of Thornfield Estates. The demands followed like invoices from hell. Fresh stain on all 12 cabins, $15,000. Replace signage with community-appropriate branding, $8,000. Landscaping to match neighborhood standards, another $12,000. $35,000. 60 days. I drove to Delilah's fortress of a home, steel, glass, and a lawn cut so sharp it could have been a crime scene. She answered the door in designer perfume thick enough to choke a man and gave me the smile of someone who had already decided I was beneath her. "We just need time," I told her, hands open, voice steady. "We'll do the work." "But $35,000 in 2 months? That's impossible." Her expression didn't shift an inch. "Your property values affect everyone's property values, Mr. Hartwell. Compliance is not negotiable." Not negotiable. That was her mantra. I walked away, knowing reason had no place here. She wasn't after compliance. She was after submission. By July, I'd scraped together enough to stain 4 cabins. It wasn't much, but I hoped it would show good faith. Instead, 3 days later, another envelope arrived. More violations. The dock, illegal length. The gravel lot, improper drainage. Even our fire pit, open flame hazard. For violations, $500 a day. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator, watching numbers bleed across the screen like a slow hemorrhage. Sarah came in and touched my shoulder. "How bad?" $40,000 a month, I said. She pulled her hand back like she'd touched an open flame. We can't keep up with that, Rex." The twins sat in the doorway, pretending not to listen, their faces pale. That was the moment I realized this fight wasn't just bleeding us financially. It was corroding us from the inside out. The strangest thing about oppression is how it seeps into daily life. I noticed Sarah flinching every time the mail truck pulled up, like each envelope was a bullet with our name on it. The boys stopped bringing friends to the cabins. Too many afternoons had been interrupted by HOA inspectors snapping photos of our rope swing or measuring the angle of a handrail with tape. Neighbors who'd once waved now avoided eye contact. Fear spreads faster than gossip, and Thornfield Estates had plenty of both. Rumors leaked that our resort was unsafe, falling apart, a liability. Bookings dropped. Guests canceled last minute. The walls were closing in, and I could feel Delilah's hand behind every shadow. But here's the thing about poison. It doesn't just kill, it hardens what survives. One night, after another round of violation notices, Sarah slammed the stack onto the table so hard the plates rattled. "They're trying to break us," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "But they don't get to take this place. They don't get to take us." Her eyes were glassy, her cheeks flushed, but beneath it was steel I'd never seen before. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel alone. That was the summer I started spending my nights in the courthouse basement, chasing paper trails through dust-caked records older than me. While the HOA tried to drown us in fines, I went hunting for a lifeline. I remembered something my grandfather once told me. When someone's trying to steal your land, the first thing you do is check who really owns it. Most men leave their wisdom in books. My grandfather left his in blood and soil. And if Delilah Thornfield thought she could erase Pine Haven with paperwork and intimidation, she was about to learn the hard way that our family didn't build on sand. We built on bedrock, and bedrock doesn't scare easy. It happened on the night I finally thought I could breathe again. After weeks of combing through courthouse records, I'd uncovered something. Our cabins, docks, even the fire pit, all built decades before zoning laws existed. We were grandfathered in. The fines that had been bleeding us dry were nothing but monopoly money dressed up in legal letterhead. For the first time in months, I laughed. I kissed Sarah goodnight with a promise on my lips. It's turning. We're going to beat them. At 2:17 a.m., the universe set itself on fire. I woke to Sarah shaking me, her voice hoarse and raw. "Rex, wake up. Something's burning." The smell hit before the words fully registered. Acrid, chemical, sharp. I threw on jeans, grabbed boots without socks, and bolted for the door. The glow outside wasn't the calm flicker of campfire. It was a violent orange storm clawing at the sky. The maintenance shed, the heart of Pine Haven, was engulfed. My body moved before my mind could. I sprinted across the gravel, stones biting my bare feet. The heat hit me like a wall, pushing tears from my eyes before grief could. Inside that shed were 3 generations of tools, records, heirlooms. My grandfather's hands had touched every shelf in there. Now those same shelves groaned under the weight of flame. I heard the scream of propane tanks seconds before one blew. The explosion ripped through the night, showering sparks into the trees. I hit the dirt, covering my head, lungs burning as smoke wrapped around me. Behind me, Sarah pulled the boys back toward the cabins, her cries cutting through the chaos. By the time the volunteer fire trucks arrived, all that was left was a skeleton of twisted steel and embers hissing like snakes. The fire chief shook his head as he studied the ground. 3 separate burn patterns, he muttered. This wasn't an accident. His words didn't surprise me. They just confirmed what I already knew. Someone had lit this match on purpose. At dawn, she arrived. Delilah Thornfield, immaculate in designer jogging clothes, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand, as though she'd just strolled out for a morning walk. Her white sneakers were spotless. Her smile, sharp enough to draw blood. "Such a tragedy," she said, as if rehearsing for the cameras that weren't there. Though I must admit, that old shed was quite an eyesore. Perhaps this is an opportunity for something more aesthetically pleasing. Her voice was calm, almost sympathetic, but her eyes told the truth. They glittered with satisfaction. I wanted to lunge at her, drag that coffee from her hand, and pour it on the ashes of everything she destroyed. Instead, I stood silent, fists clenched, my chest heaving as the fire steam rose between us like a veil. That was the moment I stopped believing this was just about property disputes. This was war. 2 days later, an envelope appeared on my office desk. No stamp, no return address. Inside were photographs. Morton Thornfield at the local hardware store, buying 3 5-gallon gas cans. The receipt was still attached, his signature clear as day. At the bottom, a single line written in block letters. Some of us are disgusted by what they're doing. A neighbor for the first time, I realized not everyone in Thornfield Estates was blind. Someone inside their fortress was leaking truth, and that truth burned brighter than the fire ever could. But insurance didn't care about truth. To rebuild the shed, I needed their payout. And to get the payout, I needed a compliance certificate from the HOA. Delilah refused to sign it. At the next board meeting, she announced with mock solemnity, we'll be requiring all commercial properties to install sprinkler systems. $40,000 minimum. Public safety must transcend sentimental attachments to outdated structures. She said it like she was quoting scripture. I looked at Sarah across our kitchen table, the calculator between us, numbers bleeding across the screen. 40,000 here, 70,000 there. Insurance withheld. Guest canceling. Each digit was another noose tightening around our necks. For the first time, Sarah said the words I'd been dreading. maybe we should sell before they destroy us completely. The boys were upstairs, but I knew they were listening. The silence in the house had that heavy, listening quality. My chest ached as I imagined them hearing their mother consider selling the place their grandfather built. No, I said, my voice steady in a way I didn't feel. If we sell, they win. And if we fight, maybe we lose. But at least we'll lose on our feet. Sarah studied me across the table, her eyes shining with exhaustion and something else, fear, maybe even doubt. I didn't blame her. Part of me doubted too. But another part, the part that had grown up on this land, watching my grandfather's hands turn raw wood into something lasting, that part had finally woken up. I wasn't just defending a business anymore. I was defending a legacy. And I was done playing defense. The night after the board meeting, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the pines made my heart leap. I kept replaying Delilah's smirk, the sprinkler system decree, the ashes of my grandfather shed still hot in the dirt. They weren't just trying to bleed us dry. They were trying to erase us. I sat alone at the kitchen table long after Sarah and the boys had gone to bed. The house silent except for the tick of the old wall clock. In front of me, a stack of violation notices, the anonymous photos of Morton buying gas cans, and a yellow legal pad where I'd scrawled one word across the top in block letters. Va. The next morning, I called Jenny Blackwood. Jenny wasn't a lawyer yet, but she was the kind of paralegal who could pull apart legal language like a watchmaker dismantling gears. When she walked in my office carrying 3 binders and a gallon of gas station coffee, I knew I'd found the right ally. "Let me see their bylaws," she said, brushing ash off the chair before sitting. I slid the packet across the desk. She flipped through it with quick, ruthless efficiency. 5 minutes in, her eyebrows shot up. Well, they've been passing emergency rules without a quorum. That's illegal. Every single one of those compliance demands? Challengeable. My pulse quickened. So we can fight back? Jenny smirked. Oh, honey, you can do more than fight back. You can bury them. While Jenny tore through the fine print, I began reaching out to people who'd been coming to Pine Haven for decades. Families who had carved their children's initials into the dock, who kept photo albums of summers spent fishing our lake. Within days, the Save Pine Haven Facebook group exploded. Stories poured in. Kids learning to swim here, couples celebrating anniversaries, veterans spending their first peaceful vacation after war. Sarah sat beside me one night, scrolling through the comments, tears rolling down her cheeks. "They love this place," she whispered. "They won't let it die." For the first time in months, I saw hope in her eyes. It felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. But Delilah wasn't going quietly. Within a week, I noticed a stranger with a clipboard prowling around the cabins. He claimed to be a compliance inspector. By the time he left, he'd written up 47 new violations. Loose handrails, unsafe rope swings, even expired fire extinguisher tags. It was harassment, plain and simple. But every report carried a weight designed to crush us further. The twins watched from the porch as the inspector snapped photos of our cabins like we were criminals. Later that night, Luke slammed his fist on the dinner table. "Why don't you just call the cops?" he demanded. His voice cracked, a boy's rage tangled with helplessness. "Because the cops can't fix this," I said quietly. "This isn't about laws. It's about power. And the only way to beat people like them is to use their own rules against them." Jake leaned forward, eyes dark. "Then do it, Dad. Make them pay." Their voices haunted me. My boys were growing up in a war zone that used to be their summer playground. And if I failed, they'd learn the worst lesson of all, that bullies win. Jenny wasn't the only ally I found. There was Marcus, our accountant guest who had a knack for spotting fraud. And Rita, the local reporter with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, who'd been following whispers of HOA corruption for years. One by one, they gathered around my kitchen table, spreading documents and laptops like generals preparing for battle. "This isn't just harassment," Marcus said, tracing a line of transactions on a ledger. "This is embezzlement. They're stealing from every single homeowner." Rita leaned back in her chair, her gaze hard. "If you can prove it, I'll put them on the front page. But you'd better be ready for war. Once the story breaks, they'll come at you with everything." I met her stare, steady. "They already burned my shed. There's nothing left they can take that I'm not willing to fight for. Still, in the quiet hours, doubt gnawed at me. One night, I found Sarah sitting on the dock, staring at the lake. Her reflection trembled in the ripples, moonlight painting her face with silver. "I'm scared, Rex," she admitted, her voice barely above the water's lapping. "What if we can't win? What if they take everything?" I sat beside her, slipping my hand into hers. "Then we'll start over. But they'll never take our dignity. They'll never take what this place means." She leaned into me, silent, and I realized the truth. I wasn't just fighting for cabins or contracts. I was fighting for the promise I'd made to her, to our boys, to my grandfather's memory. Losing wasn't an option. By late autumn, the pieces were falling into place. Jenny found smoking gun clauses in the bylaws. Marcus tracked money vanishing into Delilah's nephew's company. Rita prepared a feature story with every receipt, every signature. And me? I gathered it all into a single manila folder. Inside, it was the power to topple Delilah Thornfield and everything she thought untouchable. But power attracts danger. And as the meeting drew near, threats started to circle like vultures. Anonymous letters, smashed mailboxes, phone calls at midnight with nothing but silence on the other end. It didn't matter. The board thought they had cornered me, but they'd made one fatal mistake. They'd taught me how to fight. And now, I was ready to bring the war to their doorstep. December 15th arrived cold and sharp, the kind of morning where the frost clings to every branch like glass. By noon, the Pine Haven Community Center looked less like a civic hall and more like a battlefield. Cars jammed the parking lot, news vans lined the street, and homeowners crowded the steps, their breath clouding the air like smoke before a fire. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation and anger. Nearly 400 people had shown up for a meeting that usually drew 20. The walls seemed too small to hold the fury. At the front sat the HOA board, Delilah in her tailored blazer, Morton sweating beside her, their smiles pulled tight like masks about to crack. I walked down the center aisle, carrying my manila folder, my grandfather's worn leather gloves stuffed in my pocket. My boots echoed on the tile. Every eye followed me. For the first time, I didn't feel like the hunted. I felt like the hunter. Delilah tapped her microphone, her voice smooth, rehearsed. "Due to capacity issues, public comment will be limited to state law requires reasonable opportunity for input on budget matters." Jenny's voice cut in from the second row. She stood, legal binder in hand, calm as stone. "If you silence these people, this meeting is invalid." Sheriff Deputy Bradley, stationed by the wall, nodded once. "She's right, ma'am." For the first time, Delilah faltered. The crowd murmured, restless. I took the microphone. My hands didn't shake. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying across the packed room. "We're here to discuss our community's finances. What you're about to see will change everything you thought you knew about this board." The first slide appeared on the projector behind me. Total collected, $2.1 million. Total remaining, $23,000. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "The reserve fund required by law should hold $800,000. I continued. "Instead, it's almost empty. So where did the money go?" The next slides hit like bullets. Invoices from Delilah's nephew's landscaping company. Triple market rates. Receipts for Morton's $35,000 snowplow. Billed as a community expense. Luxury education conferences in Hawaii and the Bahamas. The room erupted. Shouts of "thieves" and "where's our money" bounced off the walls. Delilah leaned forward, gripping the table. "These are accounting errors," she snapped. Misunderstandings don't sound like this," I said. I pressed play on the audio recording. Morton's voice filled the speakers. "Once we own that resort, we're sitting on a $2 million gold mine. These hillbillies don't understand property values. It's almost charity work, really." The room fell silent, like the air had been sucked out. Then Delilah's voice followed, venomous and cold. "The Pine Haven acquisition is just the beginning. We'll force out every pre-existing property and rebuild this entire area properly. Mountain living for people who actually deserve it." The crowd exploded. People rose to their feet, pointing, shouting. A woman in the back screamed, You called us hillbillies. Another yelled, You're crooks. Morton pushed back his chair, pale as wax, and tried to slip toward the exit. Deputy Bradley stepped in his path. Sit down, sir. Delilah's composure cracked. She stood, voice shrill. This is a setup. He's lying. These documents bear your signature, I said, clicking to the next slide. Her name scrawled across fraudulent expense forms. Every dollar stolen, every contract inflated, it all comes back to you. The crowd laughed, cruel and final. The sound of a community no longer afraid. Jenny rose again. I motioned for a vote to remove the board effective immediately. Hands shot up like a tidal wave. Aye filled the hall, thunderous and unanimous. Motion carried, Deputy Bradley announced. Then came the sound that ended everything, the metallic click of handcuffs. Sheriff deputies moved to the table, reading charges as cameras flashed. Embezzlement, fraud, obstruction of justice. Delilah fought to keep her mask, but when the cuffs closed around her wrists, her face twisted, finally human, finally afraid. You can't do this to me, she hissed. I know my rights. Yes, ma'am, the deputy said calmly. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. The crowd roared as she was led out, Morton shuffling behind her, his head bowed. I stood at the podium, the weight of the moment pressing into my chest. Reporters swarmed forward, microphones thrust at me. How does it feel to bring them down? One asked. I thought of my grandfather's shed, the fire's heat, my boys watching from the window as everything we built turned to ash. This was never about revenge, I said, my voice steady. This was about accountability, about proving that no matter how much power someone thinks they have, they're never bigger than the truth. The room erupted again, not with anger this time, but with applause. A community rising from the ashes. And for the first time in months, I let myself breathe. The morning after the arrests, the mountain felt different. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that bites your lungs, but for the first time in months, it wasn't heavy. The weight that had pressed down on Pine Haven, the threats, the fines, the endless fear, had lifted. The cabin still leaned weathered and gray against the lake. Our dock still reached into the water like an outstretched hand. But something invisible had changed. The resort was no longer a target. It was a symbol. Sarah stood on the porch with coffee in hand, watching as neighbors drifted down the road. Not to complain, not to threaten, but to shake my hand, to offer tools, to ask how they could help rebuild. It felt like watching the heart of a community beat again after flatlining. The legal process churned fast, faster than anyone expected. With the evidence we'd collected, Delilah and Morton folded like brittle paper. Embezzlement, fraud, arson. The words hung over their legacy like a black cloud. Courtrooms echoed with their denials until the walls themselves seemed tired of hearing them. When a guilty pleas came, they didn't sound triumphant. They sounded inevitable. The restitution order returned over $1 million to homeowners who had been robbed blind. Checks arrived like unexpected blessings. Neighbors crying on their porches, families paying off debts, small businesses finding breath again. For us, it meant Pine Haven was debt-free for the first time in decades. Insurance money rebuilt the shed stronger than before. The smell of fresh cedar and sawdust replaced the stench of fire. But the real rebuilding wasn't wood and nails. It was trust. The boys changed in ways I hadn't expected. One evening, Jake handed me an essay he'd written for school. The title, What My Family Taught Me About Fighting Bullies. It wasn't about fists or anger. It was about standing firm, about refusing to bend when bending meant losing yourself. His teachers submitted it to the regional paper, and within a week, our son's words were printed for strangers to read. Seeing their story told through his eyes hit me harder than any headline. It meant they'd learned something deeper than fear. Luke said it best one night, sitting on the dock under stars sharp as glass. Dad, he whispered, we didn't just keep Pine Haven. We kept who we are. I'll carry that sentence with me until the day I die. The ripple spread wider than our lake. Reporters kept calling. Lawmakers invited me to testify. I wasn't a politician, but I learned to tell the story not with anger, but with clarity. People listened. The Pine Haven Act passed that spring, demanding audits, transparency, and penalties for corrupt HOA boards across the state. Other states followed. I never wanted to be a whistleblower. But sometimes life doesn't give you a choice. Sometimes the fight finds you, and all you can do is answer. As for Pine Haven, it thrived. Bookings surged, not because we upgraded or advertised, but because people wanted to be part of something that had endured. Guests came from 3 states over just to stand on the dock where we'd refused to kneel. The resort that fought back, they called it. We took some of the restitution money and started the Pine Haven Community Fund. Scholarships for local kids, small loans for struggling businesses, even a conservation easement to protect the lake forever. For the first time in years, I wasn't just keeping something alive. I was planting something that would outlast me. But the real ending didn't come in a courtroom or at a board meeting or even when the first restitution check cleared. It came one quiet evening, months later, when I stood alone on the rebuilt dock. The lake was calm, the water black glass reflecting the stars. In my pocket, I carry my grandfather's old gloves, worn thin but still smelling faintly of cedar. I closed my eyes and could almost hear him, the rasp of his saw, the rhythm of his hammer, the stubborn laughter of a man who refused to quit. He'd fought claim jumpers and storms and decades of change. I had fought lawyers and fire and greed. Different enemies, same war. And for the first time, I realized what he must have known all along. This place was never just about cabins or land. It was about standing your ground when everything else tries to move you. Ashes can destroy, but ashes can also remind you what's worth turning into stone. The world will move on from Pine Haven's war. Another story will trend. Another scandal will take the headlines. But for us, it was more than a headline. It was proof that bullies only win when silence is louder than truth. And as long as there's breath in me, I'll never stay silent again. Final lines, because places like Pine Haven aren't built with wood and nails. They're built with memory, with defiance, with love. And no fire, no matter how high it burns, can turn that to ash.